Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we meet members of Tactical Medical Wing and 4626 Squadron. We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, when the UK deploys its armed forces around the globe, the RAF's Tactical Medical Wing are standing by to respond to medical emergencies and bring injured or ill sailors, soldiers and aviators safely home. In this two-part special edition of Inside Air, we asked Squadron Leader Sarah to investigate their work. Here's part one.
You might be going out for one patient, but when you land, there's six. There are bullets ricocheting off the armour that you're sat behind or coming through the aircraft. In a 3-month tour, you would see more trauma than a lot of clinicians will see in their entire careers.
When I deployed to Afghanistan more than 10 years ago, I dealt with major trauma on a daily basis. Back then, the military was trailblazing emergency medicine in the UK. But how is it faring today? My name's Squadron Leader Sarah. I'm a full-time emergency nurse in the NHS, but for the past 32 years I've also been an RAF reservist flight nurse with 4626 Squadron. I spoke with personnel from Tactical Medical Wing at RAF Bryce Norton to explore what has changed in the past 10 years and what we are doing to prepare for future operations around the globe. My first stop was with Squadron Leader Matt, who has provided emergency medical care in the back of a helicopter whilst under fire.
So from an Air Force perspective, we have an awful lot of different capabilities from what we would call point of injury. So that's where a soldier or airman is injured on either the battlefield or on an airfield, wherever it may be, and then going out and delivering that. And we do that from an Air Force perspective with various different levels of practitioners. So we have Air Force medics, we have emergency nurses, and we also have paramedics and doctors that deliver various different levels of pre-hospital emergency care.
The public probably know the term MERT, the Medical Emergency Response Team, and I understand you played quite a key role on MERT in Afghanistan.
I think I've been involved with MERT for the last 15 years, so I've toured as the boss of that capability in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I've also been away with the Navy on numerous occasions and out to Kenya to deliver pre-hospital emergency care out there, so kind of a wide background in the last 15 years.
15 years, that's a long time to be delivering trauma care in the pre-hospital environment. Can you tell me how things have developed in that time?
I think during Iraq and Afghanistan, we made significant inroads into how we developed our capability. We were seeing more soldiers that were increasingly injured by IEDs and by gunshot wounds. And so lots of things changed in that time about how we responded, who we put on the aircraft, but also about things like taking blood forward, which we see on our UK air ambulances. The military was the first one to pioneer that in Afghanistan. I think the biggest change we saw in the whole pre-hospital space is how we train our military personnel to deliver buddy first aid and personal first aid. And I think all of us will go yearly through that training process, but things like having a tourniquet and a first field dressing when somebody is injured in the battlefield, and having those first aid skills has probably saved more lives in Afghanistan than we were able to save as part of MERT. The person stood next to you is going to save your life. The team medic who's going to be on the ground and patrolling is going to enhance that level of care. And it might be a paramedic or a doctor on the ground who takes over your care within an hour. And then for us to come as part of MERT, to fly in with a consultant, a couple of paramedics and a nurse, and then deliver anaesthetics, blood transfusions, and surgical capability on the way back to a big hospital that's set up for trauma. And I think right from the start, getting the things right with the personnel, with those first field dressings and the tourniquets, has the biggest effect on survival as we look at the pre-hospital space in the military context.
So it'd be fair to say that you were almost taking the emergency department right out into the field to that point of injury?
Yes, I think it was a change in our doctrine. Previously, we tried to get the patient to the hospital within that 2-hour window. But actually what we quickly realised in places like Afghanistan was that we actually needed to take that forward, because our soldiers were severely injured. And you'll have seen many of them on the news. They come home and made fantastic recoveries, but they were horrifically injured. And I think without the ability to push that capability right to the point where those soldiers are injured, many of them would have died. And I think in future conflicts, that is a significant capability that air offers defence.
And we'll think in a moment about the future of MERT and how it's developing, but just one more question about Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you kind of talk me through a typical mission?
I almost think there probably wasn't a typical mission in Afghanistan, because it was such a challenging environment. Wherever we were going into, it was always difficult. But we would set up on a day shift. We'd be on call for 24 hours, and we would have a team of an emergency medicine consultant or an anaesthetic consultant, and then a nurse and 2 paramedics, along with the aircrew of a Chinook and some force protection. We would be at 30 minutes readiness to move in the day and 60 minutes at night, which we would always beat. The aircrew were fantastic at spinning the aircraft up really quickly, getting the engines going and getting us lifted towards the patient. We would be being fed information over the radios as we flew out to the patient, just as you would get if somebody was making a 999 call in the UK. You'd be speaking to a controller and they'd be relaying that information to the ambulance. We would then prepare to go into whatever situation that was, be that a highly kinetic situation where the Apaches over us were shooting and to provide us to get rid of the enemy or keep their heads down, while we were able to sneak in and then quickly load the patients onto our aircraft. And I suppose differently from a UK air ambulance, where the ambulance would land, your clinicians would get off, and then you would stabilise the patient before moving them. Because of the threat on the ground, we would land on scene, the patients would be loaded into the aircraft, and then we would start to do our triage process and our treatment process as we flew back to the hospital. And for a lot of patients, that would mean in a 10 or 15 minute flight that we could give them a general anaesthetic, we could give them 8 units of blood, we could start to give them antibiotics, package their wounds and get them prepped for handover. And we were, towards the end of Afghanistan, very, very proficient at delivering that kind of capability at pace.
So what you're telling me, I think, is doctors, nurses, paramedics, medics, both on the ground and in the air, potentially coming under fire?
Yes, we were regularly under fire as we flew into some of the scenes. The ground call signs would do a fabulous job of protecting the aircraft, as would our Apache gunships and the air crew, who the loadmasters who manned machine guns at the front and the rear of the helicopter. And then when we would get off, our force protection, if required, would fire back at the enemy and allow us to get the casualties on board and leave. But I think there's many videos and stories of the aircraft coming back shot up. Clearly there are some famous when the Chinook pilot got shot in the face but still managed to get the aircraft back and get the patients back. And I'm not saying that happened every day, but it happened enough.
what it was like on the back of the Chinook, when you're flying into that dangerous situation and you're there as the medical team, you've got someone who's really badly injured and their life effectively is being put in your hands.
I think we were very lucky that we worked with such a highly professional bunch of people, and so from my perspective, I had total confidence that the air crew were going to get me in and out, and the force protection were going to protect me. But clearly, there were times where we'd gone into a hot landing zone where the enemy are firing at us, firing at the aircraft. They're firing at the ground call sign, and we went into an American call sign where there were armoured personnel carriers and tanks firing at the enemy. Our force protection had to get off and fire at the enemy. Our crewmen on the front of the aircraft, our loadmaster, were firing miniguns to get us into that American call sign because the casualties were really seriously injured. And we're trying to load casualties and get patients on and start doing the triage, but also at the same time knowing that there are bullets ricocheting off the armour that you're sat behind or coming through the aircraft. And so it sharpens the mind, and we're clearly focused on delivering the best care possible for our patients at that point, but also in the back of the mind that you're in an incredibly dangerous situation. In some ways that is scary, but we're so busy and so focused on the delivery of care to our patients at that point that you almost forget about that. And I think you probably reflect on that a little bit more once you've landed after the mission, once you've had a look at the helicopter with holes in it and gone, oh, actually, that was a bit close, wasn't it? And in some ways, in my own mind, I almost think of it as, it's like the most dangerous and exciting roller coaster in the world because you don't know what's coming up next. In the back of your mind that it could be dangerous, but also that at the other end of that, we're going to be supported by our air crew. We're going to lift and land back with the patients somewhere else. And
when you're on the back of that helicopter, on the back of that Chinook, fighting to save someone's life, is there a sense of calm or a sense of, I don't know, sort of frenetic activity?
So I think we were incredibly well drilled, and to the point where everybody in the team certainly knew what their roles were. It was almost second nature because we were so busy in delivering capability, but we literally at some points didn't need to speak as a team because we all knew what needed to happen when, and actually we could deliver that so rapidly towards the end of my time. If you'd spent 3 months working with the same doctor, what position their hand would be in when they wanted the laryngoscope handing over or the tube we put down your throat to put you to sleep. And so that almost became a little bit second nature at that point. So I wouldn't say it was frenetic, it was controlled, planned and trained, and we knew because we'd done it so much what was going to happen. Clearly there were situations where we would land on and we'd been given certain amount of information or no information before we landed, and so that added a great deal of complexity because you might be going out for one patient but when you land there's 6, and that clearly ups the pace of what we need to then deliver. But I think frenetic most of the time, no, but at times, yes.
You've just said that a lot of the time you barely even need to verbally communicate with each other, but I would imagine sometimes you did need to, and obviously the back of a helicopter at the best of times is noisy, and if there's gunfire as well, even noisier. How did you communicate with each other?
So in the early days, we used sign language and we used to shout at each other. I was very lucky to be involved in a trial of a hands-free communication system, which is now rolled out across all our capabilities. And that allowed us really to talk hands-free as a team on the aircraft, and that really upped our capability a great deal towards the end, and we still use that same system to train our teams today.
Now, I was the nurse in charge of the emergency department out in Camp Bastion back in 2010, so on the receiving end of the work of your teams. How did it feel when you could eventually hand your patient over and go back to Restock and Reset?
I think all over, we knew we were taking patients back to the most amazing trauma facility in the world at that time. I don't think anywhere was on par with Bastion in the world at that point. We knew that if we could do our bit, so the soldier on the ground had already done their bit. They'd put tourniquets on, they'd put first field dressings on. If the doctor on the ground or the medic on the ground had then come and advanced that capability, we were then able to come in, put patients to sleep if required, give them blood, do advanced surgical skills. And then we knew that if we could get those soldiers, if we could push them through the doors of resource and they were alive, they stood an absolute meteoric chance of survival. I think it was something like 98% of the patients that went through that front door of that hospital survived. And so we had probably been through trauma just like the ground call sign had, but actually to know that you were going to walk into a facility where everything that could be there was supporting us in the delivery of that patient through to resource, through to the operating theatre was just amazing.
Thank you. So I'd like now, if possible, to look at sort of current activity and then maybe future ops. So what's happening at the moment in the world of MERT?
So we have our standing commitments. We've got at least 2 around the world at the moment where we regularly deploy our personnel, mainly in Africa. And so those capabilities are, as of today, providing consultant-led pre-hospital care. There's an awful lot of development that's gone on since as well. So Afghanistan stopped, but our development of pre-hospital within the military hasn't. We have an awful lot more of our consultant cadre that work in air ambulances around the country. We have nurses and paramedics that work regularly in the ambulance service to maintain their skills. But also we've continued to develop new and innovative ways of looking after patients in combination quite closely with our civilian colleagues. But I think also we've helped to develop the trauma networks in the UK. So a lot of the lessons we've taken from Herrick and are now within the civilian sector in the NHS. And I see that when I do shifts on an ambulance or a response car in the UK. They have tourniquets, they have C-locks, they have the capabilities that were developed from Afghanistan and will go forward into future conflicts.
You said there's sort of new and emerging technologies. Are you able to give us any examples?
So a new technology would be something, or new technique would be something like REBOA, which is used by London Air Ambulance and some of the other ambulances and in hospitals currently. So previously, if we had soldiers who may have had very significant injuries to their legs, we could put tourniquets on the stump of that injury to try and stop the bleeding. And so REBOA is a specialist technique where a consultant can pass a small wire into your aorta, which is the big vessel in your stomach that carries the blood from your heart around your body. And what we can do there is we can put a little balloon inside that, and we can blow that balloon up inside your aorta, and that stops the bleeding from the lower part of your body. That can only stay in place for a short time, but actually that can be a life-saving intervention for somebody who's been stabbed or blown up or shot, both in the UK in the civilian sector, but also for us in the military. And so that is a capability that may save lives well into the future. And
that's already within the Defence Medical Service, or is that something that's come in?
So I think that is something that is now is being developed and is coming more and more into the military. Certainly because we know in the future the timelines might be a little bit longer. So in Afghanistan, our timelines were relatively short. We were working in a relatively small area of Afghanistan. But in future conflicts, those timelines might be extended. So having capabilities like REBOA will allow us to get patients to a surgical hospital that's maybe a little bit further away and maintain their condition in order that the surgeons can do an operation and save their life.
So would you say the UK's way of delivering MERT is unique?
I think it is unique, but it is being copied. And I think that's the important bit, I believe. So we in Afghanistan, we developed the capability, we really pushed it forward. I think other countries saw that it was something that made a significant difference. And there's quite a lot of research that's been done post-Afghanistan looking at patients' notes, timelines, and looking at what difference MERT did make. The research showed we made a huge difference, and therefore there are other countries such as Canada that are modelling their own pre-hospital care capabilities on ours.
And is MERT, is it just RAF, or do we see members of the other services working within that capability?
No, I think the Defence Medical Services is a tri-service community, so that's Army, Navy and Air Force. While predominantly Air provide the majority of personnel, we have Army and Navy personnel come on the MERT course because we have to deliver in the marine environment and the land environment. And so a significant proportion of our doctors are from the Army and the Navy. And so whilst originally being an Air Force capability, I think because it's seen as delivering such a vital effect to the battlefield, that actually that is translatable into the ground environment. So pushing teams forward, not just in helicopters, but into armoured ambulances, into small tented facilities, and also onto ships out at sea. So it's a really dynamic capability, and we must make sure that it's fed in with tri-service nurses, doctors and paramedics.
Just kind of reflecting on all your experience as a MERT practitioner, what do you think the message should be to that soldier who's out on the ground on ops, knowing that there's a chance they might get shot or tread on an IED?
I think we've demonstrated over the years that if you've got the required equipment and you do the required training individually and with your team when you deploy, they're going to do the life-saving stuff. For us from MERT, if we're out there with you, we are going to come and get you, and we're going to offer you the highest standard of capability that we can for that theatre, whether that be with blood, with critical care drugs, with surgical procedures. We're training for that in the UK, so when we do go to war in the future, we can continue to deliver that level of effect.
And just finally, Squadron Leader Matt, I would imagine that it must be quite sort of psychologically traumatic to be exposed to the scale of injury that you've seen on ops. How do you cope with the impact on your mental health and well-being?
I think over the years, I think, for example, in a 3-month tour, you would see more trauma than a lot of clinicians will see in their entire careers. And I think for many of my colleagues, that's had some detrimental psychological effects. I think for me, I was incredibly lucky. I had some incredible colleagues, friends who, we were in a very small team and we supported each other psychologically through that time. And I wouldn't say I'm unaffected by it, because I think anybody who's been through that has got to be affected in some way. Have I learnt to cope with it? Yes, I think. And do I feel really lucky that I'm in that position? Absolutely.
We've reflected quite a lot on Afghanistan and Iraq, but obviously we've moved beyond those operations now. What do you think we need to prepare for in the future?
I think as we move forward, we've got to be prepared to have extended timelines in that pre-hospital space. We were incredibly lucky in Afghanistan that the distances were short, but we know in future conflicts the distances might be much longer. And so if we're going to have to look after those severely injured patients, we need to make sure that the practitioners, the doctors, nurses, paramedics, medics, and the buddy care allows us the skills and the training and the time to deliver those critical care interventions over a much extended period of time. So we have personnel that are away at the moment and their flying times could be over 2 hours, whereas in Afghanistan we were typically within an hour back to the hospital. So extending that period in the pre-hospital space is a challenge, and making sure that our people are prepared with a mindset that they're going to have to deliver in that space is a challenge for the future, I think.
And how do we meet that challenge, do you think?
In some ways, it's the way we employ people, both in their UK jobs, so to make sure that they're in clinically focused jobs where they're able to make those critical decisions all the time. And that for our nurses and paramedics is working in the pre-hospital space. For our doctors, that'll be working on air ambulances. From an air perspective, it will be placing advanced practitioners onto those pre-hospital assets, so to upskill some of our nurses and paramedics, to give them the skill set and clinical decision-making models to allow them to look after patients for longer. I think some of it is about extending the range of drugs that our practitioners are able to give in those environments. And that can be far beyond what is given currently by a UK ambulance, for instance. And so those will be additions to our capability going forward in the future. I'm sure that will far outlive me and my time in the service.
And we've focused quite a lot during our conversation on the delivery of clinical care, but obviously that team dynamic and the individual's situational awareness is really key, and we talk about that in terms of human factors. How important is that within the field of pre-hospital emergency care?
I think human factors absolutely fundamental to what we deliver, and a large part of the MERT course is actually looking at that human factors perspective. Typically, you don't get things wrong because you just made a mistake. Typically, there are things that underpin that error. For a lot of us, and certainly what we challenge on the MERT course is our students' ability to raise their mental capacity whilst they're in the middle of bedlam, and produce effective communication so the team knows what's going on.
Squadron Leader Matt, you've also played quite a strong role in the delivery of DARTS. That sounds really pointy. What does it stand for, and what does DARTS do?
So DARTS are the Deployed Aeromedical Response Team Squadron, and I always try and put this over. So DARTS are like the Swiss Army knife of the RAF Med Services. They're a small team of personnel who provide a whole range of medical capability for air, and they do that 365 days a year, 24/7. The squadron as a whole as I said, is a very small team, but they can deliver care from that point of injury that I talked about earlier, right from where the individuals are injured, and take them all the way back through to supporting the strategic Aeromed move. So it offers a huge capability to defence.
And how much notice can you typically expect to be given before being deployed as part of DARTS?
So the team are consistently on 2 days' notice to move. And then depending on the ask from operations, we can reduce that readiness to just a few hours.
And how long would they be on that 2 days' notice to move for?
The teams rotate through various different capabilities, but most of them would expect to be on that for 6 to 8 months of the year.
And what sort of impact would that have on family life?
Our teams not only cover that, but they're also away covering exercises. So their time on the squadron is pretty impactful for family life, but we're also cognizant that when people are back, that they need to have that time to relax, have time with their children, partners, because we know that we are that high readiness capability, and in that break glass emergency moment, we're the ones going to be out the door. So I think most people volunteer to come to the squadron. They know what it's about. They know it's about delivering capability quickly, and they're happy to be here. And they'll do 3 years on the squadron before they move on. But quite often, those people will come back for a second tour.
And can you tell me some of the places you went as part of DARTS?
Oh, I think we went all over the world, and the squadron continues to go all over the world. I think Africa, clearly from a defence engagement perspective, is really important, and so we send our medics to help do some defence engagement there. The teams cover things like the RAF Falcons parachute training, both in the UK and abroad. We also cover things like exercise red flag. So when we send our jets out to train in America and to other places around the world, we literally will send a medical team that can provide aviation medicine specialty to those capabilities as they deploy, and make sure that the pilots and ground crew are there to operate the aircraft. So I think if you can think of somewhere in the world, we've probably been there this year, even despite COVID.
And what would you say was the most challenging mission you ever undertook on DARTS?
Oh, I think, to be honest, on my first tour on DARTS, we deployed an awful lot to Afghanistan, and the team there were really focused bunch of specialists who deployed. I suppose I think the most challenging was in 2010, one of the Pedro call sign helicopters, which was an American version of MERT, their helicopter was shot down in Sangin, and sadly a lot of the crew on that aircraft were killed that day. And so we were told at 3:00 in the afternoon that incident happened, and we deployed a further MERT out to Afghanistan by 3:00 that morning. We were on a flight out to go out and replace that capability, because we knew that the Americans would be down an aircraft and wouldn't clearly need time to recover. So we deployed rapidly for about 6 weeks, but that was just before my wedding. So the challenge was I was trying to organise my wedding reception, and I was deployed in Afghanistan, so everything was a challenge then. So I think that was probably the most challenging job that I've done.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty tall order militarily as well as personally for you. And I understand DARTS are often sort of the first ones in, or the first medical capability in, when we deploy as a force abroad. How does that feel?
As I said, I think the mindset of the squadron is we are the first people to go in, and we kind of, the people that will flow towards the squadron are the kind of people that want adventure. They want that uncertainty in their lives, and they want that excitement. As you said, we are the first people to go out the door because we're at such high readiness. But what that allows is that we can bring together another capability to come out and take over from us. So, for instance, if we were going to deploy fast jets to somewhere, we might send a small team out to set up a medical facility straight away to make sure they can operate immediately, and then we would take personnel who currently work in secondary healthcare, so our hospitals and our primary healthcare centres, and bring them to tactical medical wing, prepare them, and then send them out to that theatre of operations to continue to support those capabilities. Our personnel will then recover, repack their kit, and be ready to go to the next operation or exercise or call.
And what role has DARTS played within OpVentus, so the hurricane relief?
So typically every year we hold personnel at readiness to cover that requirement, and we have a team of highly trained personnel, medics, nurses and a doctor, who sit on a FET, and literally for 6 months they wait and watch the news, watch the weather, and make sure that there are no hurricanes that are going towards the Caribbean. But if that does happen, then they're absolutely ready to deploy and go and deliver kind of humanitarian aid, but also support the aircraft and the military personnel that we send out with primary and emergency care.
And if there's perhaps a nurse or a doctor or a paramedic or other allied health professional listening into this episode of InsideAIR, thinking maybe they might want to join the RAF, what would you say to them?
Absolutely. I worked as a nurse in an NHS hospital before I joined. I was a charge nurse in A&E. I joined the Air Force and I've not looked back. I'd also say that, as a whole force, we work really closely with our reservist colleagues. And so even if you don't want to join the Air Force full time, 4626 Squadron here at TAP Medwing and 612 in Scotland are fundamental to our delivery of operational capability around the world. I have personnel currently deployed along with my regular colleagues on DARTS delivering capability. We have, as I've just talked about with OpVentus, half of the personnel held at readiness our reserves. And through pitting those reserves, op pitting, which was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we had our reserves at readiness here at TMW to support lots of activities. So they're truly vital. So if you're thinking about joining the Air Force, do it. Apply, get down the recruitment centre. If you're thinking, I'm a professional and I might not want to join full-time, look at the reserves, because there are so many opportunities now and in the future. And when it comes to training, as we talked about with things like the MERT course, access to higher education, master's level, there's so much that the military offer to clinical personnel. So just go and do it.
Squadron Leader Matt, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
To find out more about DARTS, I spoke with Corporal Nathan, who was part of the team that cared for Afghan civilians being evacuated from Kabul last year. Corporal Nathan, you're part of the deployed Aeromedical response team Squadron, and you were deployed out to the Middle East last year in support of op pitting, which was the evacuation of refugees from Afghanistan. Could you tell us a bit more about your role?
Of course. So yes, we were deployed in August last year with the intention of providing medical support on the flights leaving Afghanistan in order to support those that were leaving and provide medical cover where it was required.
How many flights were there a day, roughly?
Usually about 3 a day, but it did vary. Certainly when we started, there was a lot less. And as time went on and sort of the urgency to remove people from the country increased, then the number of flights followed that.
What would the team sort of look like? What healthcare professionals did you have within the team each flight?
So a standard team had a clinician, whether that be a nurse or paramedic, and medic, sort of as a combination. If there were patients on the flight that required a little bit more additional skills, then we could uplift a doctor to travel with us. And if they required even more than that, then we also had additional capabilities deployed with us who could assist with that.
And when you were sort of flying towards Afghanistan, did you know in advance whether you had patients and what was wrong with them, or did you sort of typically find that out once you arrived?
So for some of the flights we did know a little bit about the patients we were going to pick up. We had a very small brief from the liaison officer that was based in the country. However, there were a number of flights where we didn't know much about them at all, and it was very much a case of having to assess patients as they walk on the back of the aircraft and make that decision of whether or not they're safe to fly.
And what type of health problems were you encountering?
So initially we had quite a lot of people faint on the flights, and that was mostly due to dehydration or malnutrition over the last few days. It's been seen in the news that a lot of them were stuck outside Kabul airport waiting to get in for up to 5 days with very little resources. On top of that, many of them hadn't flown before as well, so it was quite a shock to the system, and it wasn't in the conventional aircraft in a nice comfy seat that you would normally be in, but rather on a cold hard floor with a strap over you, which is not the best for their first experience.
And now these were civilians you were evacuating, so I'd imagine there were quite a number of children amongst them. Did you find yourselves delivering healthcare to children as well? Absolutely,
yes. So in the military, typically we provide healthcare to younger, fit, healthy individuals with maybe 1 or 2 health problems. So to treat people who have, who are from very young to very old, and multiple chronic health conditions is quite a change to what we're used to managing.
And we know that you were deployed with some level of urgency. How were you prepared to deliver that healthcare to the full range of ages?
So DARTS is a high readiness squadron, and naturally we do provide our staff with the training to prepare them for that sort of role. The clinicians on the squadron, such as myself as a paramedic, work within the NHS about 1 day a week, and that provides us some sort of exposure to a wider variety of health conditions than what we'd see on the military side. But certainly in those weeks leading up to it where we thought this may happen, that exposure on the NHS side, but also our in-house training increased quite drastically.
Okay, so you felt well prepared by the time you flew out there?
I would say so, yes.
Yeah. And there must have been a palpable sense of relief amongst those civilians as the aircraft left the ground?
Certainly. For the young children, you'd see them smiling and playing. They were very happy. And actually, the first time it hit me was when the first flight landed after we'd sort of returned from Afghanistan. And as it touched down, everyone on the aircraft clapped. And that was sort of their sense of relief and thanking us for everything we'd done for them.
So it must have been quite an extraordinary experience for you.
It was, yeah. It was very... It was unnerving initially, I'd say. We didn't know all the details of what we were going into, but it's very rewarding when you get to the other end.
Yeah. I mean, reflecting back on it at the time, I guess we didn't quite know what the security threat was going to be for the aircraft flying in and out of Kabul. What were your thoughts about that, your first flight going in?
The news was very unclear as to what was happening out there. Some days you would look at it and you'd see not a lot happening at Kabul airport, and it seemed a fairly safe place. And those other days when they're talking about potential threats and bombs and explosions and the like, which it can be incredibly unnerving heading into that sort of environment. So the first one we discussed it between ourselves. We tried to come up with the best sort of plans we could to keep ourselves safe. We discussed with the aircrew as much as possible what information they could get whilst we were flying into the country. To allow them to sort of feed that back to us and again, prepare as much as we could.
And when you reflect back on that time, that 3 weeks that you were out supporting op pitting, looking back, how do you feel about that experience now?
Like I said, very rewarding. Happy to be a part of, it's quite an unusual circumstances and not something that we've done before, certainly on that scale. Yes, those days where I was very unnerved and quite worried about what we were heading into, I think now I realise I'm glad we did it, and I'm glad we achieved what we could in the short period of time we had.
Corporal Nathan, thank you so much for reflecting on your time during op pitting. I'm very grateful.
No, thank you.
In part 2, I'll be speaking to other members of the TMW team and the bosses of TMW and 4626 Squadron. I hope you can join me then.
I'm SAC Victoria Andrews, and with a look back at some recent news stories from the Royal Air Force, this is Reheat on InsideAIR. Typhoons from RAF Lossiemouth have joined a NATO-led exercise in the skies over Estonia. Finnish Air Force F-18s, German Typhoons and Belgium F-16s took part in the large-scale exercise which trains the quick reaction forces that safeguards the skies in the region. Fast jets from France, Spain, the Czech Republic and Sweden also took part. The opportunity to integrate, plan and execute a multinational exercise of this kind demonstrates the reach, flexibility and interoperability of NATO air power. In County Londonderry, Deputy Commander Operations Air Marshal Sir Jerry Mayhew accepted the Freedom of the Causeway Coast in Glensborough Council on behalf of the RAF. The event was marked by a parade which saw the central band of the RAF and 100 regular and reservists parade in Limavady, along with the flypast of a 120 Squadron P-8 Poseidon. Air Marshal Mayhew explains the special significance of the flypast.
That one has history because it is named after a member of a squadron that was from Northern Ireland and also was the highest scoring individual on 120 Squadron during World War II and Coastal Command here in Northern Ireland, Terry Bullock. So that was really exciting that was able to come today.
And finally, a new exhibition which sheds a light on the role of RAF medics has been opened at the RAF Museum in Hendon. Unveiled by the head of RAF Medical Services, Air Commodore Dale Dabron, the exhibits showcase the last 20 years of RAF medical history. As well as medical hardware and kit, the exhibition also details videos and first-hand testimonials from those who carry out these crucial tasks. The new exhibition has the potential to be seen by up to 500,000 people each year. That's Reheat on InsideAIR.
I'm SAC Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the unmistakable waka waka sound of a Chinook taking off from RAF Odium. As one of Joint Helicopter Command's battlefield helicopter forces, the Chinook force is capable of operating globally in almost any conditions. The RAF's only heavy-lift helicopter, the Chinook has been in service since 1980, and this year, with the 40th anniversary of the Falklands conflict, it celebrates 40 years on ops. However, protecting the UK is a first priority for the MOD. That's why RAF Odium keeps a Chinook on 24-hour national standby to support military aid to civil authority and provide other government agency support. So, next time you hear a waka waka in the sky, do give the crew a wave.
That's all for this episode of InsideAIR. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to InsideAIR, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. InsideAIR is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.